once told me that every speaker should follow the 3 B's. He should be truthful, he should be brief, and he should be seated. So just in terms of a brief outline, in terms of the question that you've posed, it's interesting to note that the Rambam puts the laws of Kashrut, Machalos Asuros and Hilchos Shchita, in his volume Kedusha, and including that is also Isurei Bia, forbidden sexual relationships. Because we believe that through observing the ritual of Kashrut and all the other laws related to it, we attain a certain level of Kedusha, and that's a function of discipline and purpose. The Torah tells us Kedoshim Tiyu. The Ramban says Kedoshim Tiyu is an overarching principle, that even things that are permitted by the Torah, but if they're socially unacceptable, they also fall under the rubric of Kedoshim Tiyu. The Ramban in his famous language says, otherwise a person could be a menuvel b'shus HaTorah. He could be an abhorrent person with the sanction of the Torah. So it goes without saying that the Kedusha represented, where the Ram puts Shchita and so on, Hilchos Kedusha, and the Kedusha Kedoshim Tiyu can't be severed. That doesn't mean to say that they're exactly the same category. Halacha ultimately is a legal system, and they're not. Somebody can violate a law in one area, and it doesn't necessarily compromise the status in a different area. Experts on this who've told you otherwise, especially people from the American Laborers Union or Commercial Workers Union, and have argued this case over and over again, that somehow, for example, agree that the kashrus has been compromised, is simply inaccurate. But that doesn't mean to say that we're not concerned about these issues. We have to be concerned, I think, on lots of levels. First of all, the underpinning of the entire Torah, I said, is Kedoshim Tiyu. And basic Jewish ethics is based on V'halachta b'dracho v'mat yodei, copying Hashem, following in His ways. So that's a fundamental principle. There's another reason why it's important. It's simply we have to be concerned of the perception of kosher to the general world, and not just kosher, everything else related to our observance. The other reason is we're concerned with the perception of kosher and how Jews appear, because we don't want to create a Chil Hashem. And also, we're concerned about how our feathered Jewish brethren view this, because we want to reach out to them. And all of those things are issues that we have to be concerned with and find balance. And it's not always so obvious how to strike that balance. In nature organizations, Teiku means a conundrum. Conundrum that remains unresolved. And I think what you're learning here at Yeshiva, and what's important to know is that these issues are not obvious sometimes. And there's nuance that's required, and the judgment calls. They're not always obvious what directions they should go, especially when balancing all these different disparate concerns. And we have to sometimes live within the tension of a takeaway, of not knowing the exact resolution. But I just want to mention, just juggling all these issues, one of the things in terms of the Kashrut Tzedek that we have to think about, I myself have issues with the Kashrut Tzedek, and I just want to tell you briefly what they are. I've met with Rabbi Morris Allen and Rabbi Michael Siegel in my office about them. But I want to put the Kashrut Tzedek in a different context. My concern with them is that I believe that these issues that were raised are more appropriately handled by federal and state officials that have the mandate, the authority, the expertise to deal with them. Social issues, environmental issues, workers' issues. There's a whole plethora of federal agencies, OSHA, USDA, FDA, EPA, that deal with these issues. And they have that mandate, and I don't think we can do it as well or as appropriately as them. And some of what I told the people in Kashrut Tzedek, I think the definition of some of these standards that they're going to try and I say this well-meaningly, to reach are going to be difficult. To concretize them, they're very amorphous. And I told this to Rabbi Seal, the very first one he told me was that they're only going to give their stamp to somebody who, to a company that pays its workers at least the median wage in that industry. Not the average, the median wage. Which means by definition that one half of the companies in the United States are unethical or unworthy of their approval. And I think that's something that ought to be thought about. I think just on its face, it's not correct. So just defining them is difficult. Having said that, I think that they have succeeded in terms of an initiative. I look at it somewhat differently, I think, than my colleague, Rabbi Schaffer, in that I think that it's something positive in this respect. One of the things, as I said, we're balancing is people's perception of kosher. We, at the OU, and here generally, we're interested in people keeping kosher. We're interested in keeping kosher, for people keep kosher because it's a basic tenet of our faith. But even more fundamentally, what defined the Jewish home for generations was that people kept kosher. And when I was growing up as a boy, I remember I had friends, they weren't Orthodox, they were conservative Jews, who had kosher homes, whatever the standard was, but they had 2 sets of dishes. They didn't keep kosher in the home, they didn't keep kosher out of the home necessarily, but they did within the home. And that enhanced a sense of Jewish identity. The erosion of people's perception of kosher, by almost willy-nilly, will affect their identity as Jews. So this whole story, as it emerged in Chil Hashem, out of concern for us on lots of levels, but not at all. I mean, not at the least of it. The average American Jew, not the observant Jew, what was his perception in terms of his identity with Judaism? Kashrut said anything in that sense, if I mentioned the problems that I see with it, but the initiative itself, I think, is meant also on their part to try to make their own constituency back to kosher. There are such, very, very, beginnings of such notions, both in conservative and reform movement, and that's something that we should applaud and we should encourage. I usually, when I don't know what's the right thing to do, I always think to myself, what would the Rav have done? And it's interesting that the Rav was actually engaged in this very issue. One, to his enormous detriment. When he first came to Boston, he took up, I think my time is just running out, right? So I've already violated 2 of my P's. So, maybe I'll get to it in the question and answer.
Yeah, you can finish the
When he first came to Boston, he was concerned about the standards of kashrut in Boston and also the treatment of the shoftim. That he thought that they were working very long hours, it was just abusive hours, and he took a stand about it. And it cost him enormously because there were the different forces within Boston, I'd have to say nefarious forces, that made claims against him, absolutely false claims that they somehow undertake in terms of the kashrut. This went to the Attorney General of Massachusetts. At the end, after the investigation, what was discovered was that the Rav was paying people out of his pocket. And I think the judge said he never met a man as honest as the Rav. But the point I made was this was a matter, he was the greatest genius of his time. This was his concern, and he paid very dearly for it. Actually changed his whole, I think, his notion in terms of leadership subsequently. The other thing about the Rav, which I would speak about in the questions, was about the creation of a pen and how do we respond to this kind of a question. But I'll leave that for the conference.